welcome to this Talks at Google event. I'm going to have to ask you all to stop reading the book that was on the seats and actually enjoy hearing from the author of the book. So I'm Zoubin Ghahramani. I'm VP leading foundational research at Google DeepMind, very close by. And so before we get started, I wanted to just remind everybody that we'll be talking live, and we'll have virtual questions at the end of the talk, and that there's also a mic here in the middle of the room, so you'll have fairly good discussion, hopefully. We'll leave some time for that. So I'm really excited to introduce today's guest, Neil Lawrence. So Neil is the inaugural DeepMind Professor of Machine Learning at the University of Cambridge, where he also leads the AI at CAM effort. It's the university's flagship effort around AI. He's a senior AI fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, visiting professor at University of Sheffield, and of course the author of this book, The Atomic Human, that many of you are looking at right now. And we're going to discuss his book. So let's welcome Neil.
Thanks, Zoubin.
So I have to confess that Neil and I are very good friends. We've known each other for, I don't know how long, decades.
Probably, yeah, like 25, 28 years.
Yeah. And
since before neural networks were cool.
Yeah.
Or since they were cool a long time ago.
Yeah. In one of those phases when they were cool. And you know, I wouldn't have agreed to this if Neil hadn't dropped my name on the first few pages of the book. So look out for it. In fact, you know, the book actually starts out with a lot of sort of interesting historical anecdotes about kind of the transition that I think we've been through in the field of AI over the last couple of decades, where, you know, I feel like we were both kind of just machine learning researchers with our heads down, and now it's become this societally incredibly significant time. And in fact, I want to start out with a quote from early on in the book, which is, Neil wrote, oh, by the way, I have to say, I haven't read the book. No, but I have heard Neil's voice in my head for a couple of weeks while listening to the book as an audiobook, and I highly recommend that. He read it himself. He does all the accents
I can
himself.
read and everything.
Yeah. It's very amusing to hear all the different accents that he does, and especially being good friends with him. It was just amusing to go to sleep with Neil's voice in my head.
It's brilliant for going to sleep too.
Yes, it's brilliant for that and for lots of other things. So I wanted to start out with this quote, which I relate to as well. He writes in his book, overnight I had become an expert in AI. I went from being the person people most wanted to avoid at parties to the one people most wanted to talk to. Actually, Neil, people really like to talk to Neil at parties, so I think that's more accurate about me than about Neil. But yeah, why don't you walk us through that? You know, what do you think happened? How do you think that transformed for us?
Yeah, and I guess it's hard because you're always putting a narrative to a phenomenon. And so for me, the moment when that happened, I talk about it in the book, was the moment when Yann LeCun launched the Facebook AI Lab. And there's a sort of funny story behind that I didn't really know the details at the time. They were expecting within the next couple of days to announce Facebook's AI center in London, which was going to be DeepMind. But there was this bidding going on. And of course, Google won through on that. So part of their plan was to announce, or their thinking, and then I didn't know this at the time. But Jan stood up and said, we're launching this Facebook AI lab, and I was like, oh goodness, he's called it AI. And I just knew at that moment, because people are fascinated by the term AI. And for me, it wasn't a term that I subscribed to. This, as I say in the book, the notion of, difficult saying this here, the notion of solving intelligence made no sense to me. Intelligence isn't a problem. I was interested in problem solving. But that experience has been interested. And I think the problem we now face, and I'm sure we all get this if you're in machine learning AI, is the people who most want to talk to you are the ones who are most keen to give their theory of how intelligence works. But actually the people I enjoy talking to most are regular people and what their opinions are of this. Because it's brought two things. It's brought this heightened excitement, which means there's a lot of shysters and grifters and hangers-on trying to make a buck. But it's also brought interest from people in the street. And that's incredibly important.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book was that it had a very broad audience in mind. This is not a book by a technologist just about technology. And in fact, there is a great sort of historical context. You go into like the history of technology and try to situate AI within that. So who are you thinking of when writing this book? Who is your audience, and what does AI mean to you, and what were you trying to convey to people?
It's a really interesting question, because I mean, you have in your mind, I really wanted to change the conversation, empower people, give them confidence about the technology, and be clear that it's about them and that they know just about as much about it as us. I don't mean in the technical sense, but I mean, or we need them to know as much about it. I was in the States this last week, and I realized that a lot of the time in the US, I can never work out how the showers work, because they sort of work differently. You've got to spin the knob or something like this. Now, I know how a shower works fundamentally. I know it's mixing hot and cold water, right? And I know also that in a hotel room, that they're circulating the hot water so that it comes through quickly. I know a bunch of technical stuff about a shower.
And they have taps that mix the water in the US, which is a great novelty.
It's confusing to me. There should be hot water coming out of one and cold water coming from another, and you should have to move your hands very rapidly between the two to achieve, which is, particularly for computer scientists, that's a binary system, which makes a lot more sense. So yes, totally. I mean, but it was making me think, sort of like, this is the situation with AI. People are being told this is too complex for you to understand. When the truth is, the thing people need to understand is, how do I turn the knob to get the right temperature? You don't need to understand how the water's mixing. You need to understand how to use the tool. And you know, it's like same with cars. People need to understand how they operate the car to get where they want to go, or what the effect of the car is on society. And we need to be having that conversation. So you're trying to bridge into a world where people can bring their own intuitions and their own understandings to this technology. Because if we do it the way we're going at the moment, where it's being imposed on people by very few select people, that's disastrous for society. It's such a transformational technology. I mean, I don't believe in the notion of AGI or anything like that. I think that's an absurdity. But this is a massively transformational technology. You don't need to have that concept to see that this is an enormously transformational technology. And we need people engaged.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of just the terminology AI, it was amusing to read about how we've all gone through this, people in the field have gone through this rebranding, right? You know, we both consider ourselves sort of machine learning and statistics researchers, or at least a decade ago for sure. Yeah. So I was amused about, you know, your passage where you're mentally correcting AI headlines to read, you know, computers and statistics, like, you know, whether a meeting like international cooperation on computers and statistics would be would attract such interest, or whether we would convene a global forum on computers and statistics for humanity. It's very, but things have really changed, right? You know, it's not just computers and statistics.
Yeah, and the example, as someone who did a lot on supply chain, always been interested in engineering in the real world, the example I often compare it to is the process of containerization. So globalization is driven by containerization, right? This happens like in the 60s, 70s, 80s. The reason you have dockers going on strike in Liverpool is because you don't need so much labor when you have containerization. So moving things around in these shared size things. There was no societal debate about that, right? It's had tremendous consequences. It's what means that, you know, when you fish shrimp off the coast of Scotland, you freeze them and send them to China for processing and send them back. And you might think, oh, this is big carbon footprint. No, it doesn't even have a very big carbon footprint, right? If you fly it, it does, but not if you ship it. And these dramatic effects that are going on with technology and engineering, and as an engineer being involved with them, going on unnoticed by the wider population, but having enormous downstream effects on society. And so on the positive side, you know, that is what's drawing the attention in. But of course, the attention is often being drawn to the wrong people or people without the expertise. So there's this struggle for the voices of those who actually understand the downstream effects, whether they're on the social sciences or what the technology can do, to be heard above the noise. These two things going on at the same time.
Yeah, it is certainly just really important to, at this point in history, to help people understand and situate what AI is, what intelligence is, what it means to them. You have a passage in the book where you talk about how you want to, and I'll quote, unpick some of the confusion we've seen between intelligence as an entity and intelligence as a characteristic. Do you want to just elaborate on that?
Yeah, and the more I talk about this afterwards, the more I think I could have done a better job of explaining some of these ideas. But I think what's going on with some of our conversation around intelligence is that we can talk about an intelligence and intelligence as an entity. And I think when we're using the words in that way, it's got a similar quality to when we talk about things like beauty or obscenity. If we say intelligence is a sort of shared human concept, like it's not defined from first principles, it's just we all know what it means, like we might all know what beauty means. Opinion can vary around it a little bit. And in particular, when we think of it, if we think of Zoubin as an intelligence, or us individually as an intelligence, I think it becomes quite hard to say, like, to quantify us, to measure us, to think of us as one being better than another. I think something we're going to come on to later is why there is a diversity of intelligences and capabilities. And the example I compare to in the book is like, what is the best vehicle, right? I don't know. I mean, I like my bicycle. I brought my Brompton here. I was saying earlier, it's like a security blanket, you know.
From King's Cross to here, he felt like he needed his
I felt like I need my Brompton. So for me, it's a Brompton. But, you know, when I came back from the States, I landed last night, I didn't use a Brompton, right? So the best vehicle is dependent on the context. So we can only start talking about what the right vehicle is when we understand what you're trying to do, right? And then when we think about that in intelligence, the same is true. So if I talk about a context as the property of a decision and situation, I can talk about what the right vehicle is or which intelligence was best, which approach was best. If I can say, well, what I'm trying to achieve is to move Neil from New York to London, I can talk about different decisions I might make, and I can probably rank them if I've defined what my criteria is it energy, is it climate change, is it time, whatever else. But without the context, I can't say anything about that, right? Or I can back away a little bit from that. I can say some things. But the point is in the book that the notion of an artificial general vehicle is absurd. It's simply absurd. There is no single vehicle that could fit in all these circumstances. And in a similar way, the notion of artificial general intelligence is absurd. right? Now, let's step back a bit from that. That doesn't mean there aren't general principles behind intelligence that we can't look at. Like there are general principles behind vehicles. I was on, I think, a 787 that has wheels. It has wings. It has engines. There's theory behind it. There's aerodynamics.
Yep.
There's all these sort of components. Some of those things apply to my bicycle. Yeah. Right? But they apply in different ways. And the same is true when we're sort of studying intelligence. So I do have a way that I'm trying to work on to sort of look at a very abstract situation, which I can think of where I can talk about intelligence in the way that we might talk about heat. But that would be to look at Schrodinger's bridge, which is a specific abstraction of I've got probability at time 0, probability at time 1. I've got physics that allows me to move the probabilities. That, to me, is the best abstraction I can come up with of intelligence, right? Stochastic differential equations, optimal transport, for those of you who are into that. But it requires me to define things. It requires me, what are your probability distributions over? What is your physics? Et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And if I have that, I can now rank intelligences in terms of their entropy production or something else like that. But the problem we now have is people are conflating these two things. So when you talk about something like a singularity, there's an implicit assumption that there's a universal ranking of intelligences, that there's some sort of ladder we can climb up, and that's going to some sort of intelligence explosion. And that's conflating these two things, intelligence as an entity and intelligence as a property, as a characteristic of a system.
Yeah, no, I completely agree that a lot of the narrative around intelligence has been sort of centered around maybe human-like intelligence. And in fact, there are just many different forms of intelligence as a characteristic for solving different intelligence tasks, right?
Which is the beauty of AI, because you're gaining access to a different form. And also within human intelligence, there's a diversity of approaches. So even as humans, we're not all the same. There's different qualities to different people.
Yeah, and I'd love to understand the sort of Schrodinger's bridge view of intelligence. I'm just picturing Schrodinger's cat walking over Schrodinger's bridge and trying to figure that out. But let's move on from that. And
we need to get to go to Max Welling on that. He's sort of super.
He'll figure it out for us. Yeah. So I think you get frustrated enough with the human-centric view of intelligence that you actually coin a new word in your book. Anthroxing.
Anthroxing, yeah.
Because it's too difficult to say anthropomorphizing, especially in a large audience. If you have to write anthropomorphizing hundreds of times in a book, I think that would get pretty annoying. But seriously, it is an issue with a lot of the narrative around AI these days, right?
Yeah, and so I think, I can't really say anthropomorphization properly, so I said just anthrox. We're just anthroxing things. And it's an important quality of human intelligence. And as I sort of cover in the book, we do it because the fundamental difference between us and the machine is, well, to me, the nice thing is we can talk about information, right? We can talk about information movement and processing. That's really fundamental. And we can rank our ability to move information versus the machines. And you can my estimate is the machine can access information 300 million times faster than us. So this is not an analogy I use in the book, but that's, the difference between that is walking speed, 1 meter per second, and light speed, 300 million, right? So we inside are computing with electricity, but we communicate with sound, which gives us this factor of 1 million. Some engineering gives the other 300. And that means our intelligence is constantly working across different human beings, trying to use this narrow bandwidth. And that means we dedicate much of our intelligence to modeling what we're communicating with, anthropomorphizing things. And then whenever we're presented with some form of intelligent entity, we tend to anthropomorphize it. And towards the end of the book, I also sort of highlight that when we represent our ecology in such a way that enables us to live alongside it sustainably, you're looking at indigenous groups that anthropomorphize their ecology. They anthrox their ecology. They give animistic practices to plants, to water springs, etc., so that they can represent the complexities of their ecology in their head. So this can be a very, very positive thing when used correctly. It's not true from the sort of rationalist or the new rationalist, reductionist sense that a tree has a spirit. But if you think of a tree having a spirit, you might coexist better with your forests. But I think where it's coming in now is in a very dangerous way. It's and it's sort of akin, I sometimes think of it as people are looking at the capabilities of AI, which are very different from ours, a very different form of intelligence, and sort of saying, well, if I had those capabilities, I'd do this, therefore existential risk. And it's like that's saying more about the person who's saying that than that's saying about the technology. Because there's a lot of people that wouldn't do those things, right? And it's this very simple form of empathy we use, where the first thing we assume was Zoubin, if I were in Zoubin's shoes, I would have done this for that reason, which is a first approximation, but Zoubin's different from me, right? And so I think it's simultaneously this very powerful thing that is utterly embedded in us, consciously and subconsciously, and right at the heart of our intelligence. But it can be used in two ways. One, to sort of mislead us about something, or one to enable us to psychologically represent in a way. And I think the challenge is that when you look at something like animism, that presumably emerged, well, it did emerge, over years of cultural evolution within those groups, and the groups that had those concepts presumably survived better than those that didn't. And we're dealing with these technologies without that time frame to assimilate them within our culture.
Yeah, I mean, it clearly is moving very quickly. But one of the things that I really loved about your book was the historical context that you bring up. So you place AI in the long arc of the history of technology, the history of information theory, the Industrial Revolution. I learned a lot about steam engines from your book, which I wasn't expecting. And it was just wonderful to see all the links that you made. And there was clearly a lot of scholarly work. As a machine learning researcher, I'm sure that it wasn't part of your day job to learn about all these things, but you spent a lot of time researching all the technological links. But one of the eras that you particularly focus on is the sort of explosion in computing around the Second World War. And you tie the book back to that. You even end the book, no spoilers here, but the book was actually published on a D-Day anniversary.
Yeah.
And you tie the end of the book back to the people who sort of contributed so much to all the progress that we have now.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that? So how did you choose that period to focus on? What were your thoughts on the kind of history of technology as you researched the book?
Yeah, I guess, it works for me at multiple levels, but part of it was like, yeah, things are moving fast, but in some sense, they aren't moving as fast as you think. So I think I noticed at some point that it's from, the printing press was developed roughly in the 1440s. And then 1520, you have Martin Luther sort of trying to separate from the Catholic Church, which is, it's one of the major results of this sharing of information, that people start to push back against existing mechanisms that run society and provide all sorts of interesting things like security, whether or not you think, they're too autocratic or whatever. And then noticing, oh my goodness, it's the computer's being developed in the 1940s, and sort of 2020, we're starting to see these really enormous social effects. And I think part of that is because it takes time to assimilate. Like those of us who were around for the early days of the internet, it was going to be all these different things. It was going to be, and I think Google is built on that idea of distributed information and empowering individuals and information. And then Facebook sort of comes along and goes, well, no, I'm just going to make it a walled garden. Obviously, we can just consolidate this in one place. and control the whole of the internet, which, stunned everyone. But of course, to someone like Mark Zuckerberg, who grew up with the internet, that's the obvious answer. Because you have to be familiar, and I think there's a great quote from Douglas Adams about this. You have to be familiar with these technologies before you really understand what they're used for. And so to see that arc, I think you have to go back to history. And then the history of sort of information processing really seems, you can go back to punch cards for sure. You can look at looms and things like that. But when you start doing information processing at scale, I kind of think that Second World War story is kind of an extraordinary one, Bletchley Park. And we happened to have organized a meeting at Bletchley Park in about 2006 before the story was well known. So I had this personal experience of it. And then I think the other thing I really appreciated about it was that fundamentally in that whole story, it's Eisenhower who has to say, we go tomorrow. And I found these videos of him walking among the troops, talking to people who died the next day. And, it makes the hairs go back on the back of my neck, thinking about doing that. And this story that he wrote down, he sort of wrote down this counterfactual of this note that what he was going to read if the landings failed after he left, having decided the landings were going to occur. This sort of like imagining what he would have to do. Partially, you wonder if potentially you would have to do that, because if the landings are failing, and they're being pushed back, how much are you going to be dealing with as a human being? He probably wanted that moment of clarity to just think about the thing he should say, rather than having to think about the thing he should say, where he's dealing with the consequences of his decision.
Yeah, and you tie this in with information systems and decision making. So, for example, in a chain of command, in Eisenhower's case, he was collecting information to make decisions. Or in a supply chain, you're sort of optimizing a system to make decisions. And so that's sort of where you tie it into the concepts of AI, but also this was an incredibly historically significant time for AI, with Alan Turing working at Bletchley Park. And, I remember that meeting in Bletchley Park as well.
Yeah.
It was a really amazing place.
Watching the thing that isn't in the book, and it's odd that David Mackay doesn't appear in the book at all, because he's such an inspiration for me, but watching David Mackay talk to the person who'd reconstructed Colossus, and just realizing if this was like 60 years ago, David would be at Bletchley Park. And what that would have meant for us to have been involved in that sort of thing.
Yeah. And you also you just alluded to the somewhat unpredictable nature of technology and how it takes time for the effects to be felt in society. And I'm just reminded of, I was listening to a podcast where Yuval Noah Harari was talking about the printing press, in fact, and how the first things that were printed, the things that went viral, were like witchcraft, manuals for chasing witches and identifying them, and all sorts of things that were not societally great. And then less than 100 years.
Sounds quite useful.
Well, yeah, I guess. We tend to sort of idealize the long-term outcome of technologies, but sometimes the short-term disruption is very significant, right?
And this is something that I really strongly believe. We're inventing this technology predominantly on the West, on a cultural foundation of this narrative that we lucked out on. There's a number of times where this could have gone wrong, as if the arc of history is going in this certain direction. And that's, number one, that's not necessarily the case. And number two, it's not the experience of many people in many different countries across the world. And one of the things that made a big impression on me with my colleagues in Africa, for example, is that when you discuss their governments, most, I get the impression, I don't want to speak for all of them, are first of all far more worried about the security of their government in terms of whether they can get their kids to school, whether they can earn a living, the sort of stability that you need in your environment before you can start worrying about democracy. And so security sort of comes first. And of course, the number one thing these technologies do is undermine security. Now, they may be leading to some sort of promised land of future democracy, as sort of happened to happen in Europe, right? But lots of people died to get here. And it's by no means certain that you were going to get here, right? You also had totalitarianism emerging. And I somehow think we forget that. And that's why I end with the sacrifices of those people, because I feel very keenly that, like, you know, all these sort of jokes, going on about the war. Yeah, granddad, you know, you did this in the war. Yeah, they did. And they've gone. And they're not here to remind us anymore what that meant. And it seems to me increasingly we're forgetting that and assuming that we've just inherited this forwards arc, which I just don't think is true at all. It requires all of us to constantly work towards that, while being mindful that our perception of what that is, if we live in the UK or the US or Europe, is very different from many people's lived experience across the world.
Yeah, and I mean, what clearly comes out in the book is that this is also part of your personal story and your family's story as well, that touches on the part that we play in, you know, the bigger history.
Yeah.
Right?
And the parts that we all play as a sort of microcosm in that, and the parts that our cultural values play in steering us towards that, you know, whether we agree with different cultures' values, how we collaborate together, and how over time we bring these things through. I think one of the things I think at the end people say, what surprised you about the right? I mean, one of the things I tend to think about more is that actually, in some sense, the seat of our intelligence is not where we feel it to be, which is an observer bias, where we sit there thinking about what we're planning or what we're going to do. It's in the culture around us and the way that we're interacting. It's within the things that are passed down to us, and we're just individual instruments within that. And the error of thinking that it sits within the imaginings we're having in our head, that sort of egocentric error, and that an individual is capable of imagining what that future is really at the heart of what could be a new wave of digital totalitarianism, right? That some people who are incredibly intelligent, incredibly highly empowered at the moment, and incredibly unaware of their limited understanding of the complexity of the world, are dominating the conversation in this space and kind of have the power to bring about the futures they're talking about.
Yeah, no, clearly, I mean, this is something that is on many people's minds, right? And just understanding the effect of AI on societies, on the democratic process, on debates, the narrative. But for a lot of the world, I feel that there is also a sense of promise that comes from AI. And if you look at the potential for AI to help us solve societally challenging problems, you know, at the core of which may be like scientific advances or technological advances that could be accelerated by AI. So do you feel that that's sort of an important part of the future story of AI, its impact on science, on medicine, on
Yeah, absolutely.
technology?
And I hope it's fundamentally an optimistic book, because I am optimistic. And I think that the potential is absolutely extraordinary. Like I say, it's totally transformational technology. And when we think about science, for example, you know, so at AI at CAM, we have a motto, which is AI for citizens, science and society, or science, citizens and society, which is about what the technology can do. And I think that the reason is not because it's some form of general intelligence, artificial general intelligence, in the way it's talked about, but because it operates as certainly this latest wave of generative AI and large language models, Gemini, Claude, whatever else, are suddenly the ability for regular people to talk with a computer, which is sort of utterly transformational. So my current provocation that I like using in audiences of computer scientists is, if we were going to try and eliminate one profession, you know, to replace, the profession we should be replacing is software engineer, right? Because the software engineer is just acting as a sort of operator between someone who has a vision of what the computer should do. They're like getting in the way of the pen. They're like the arm of what the person is trying to create. And they're sort of like, oh, you thought you wanted this, but actually you didn't. You really wanted this. Maybe. But that is a bottleneck of creativity, right? And the way I view it in the book is that software engineers are like modern scribes. So the scribe held a great deal of power, in ancient societies. And then what happened with the printing press is that sort of got democratized. Everyone had some form of access to that. But also what happened with scribes is they gained responsibilities, right? So, the scribes became accountants, lawyers, whatever. They became professions with social responsibilities. Whereas the software engineer, as the modern scribe, doesn't have that social responsibility. There aren't the regulatory mechanisms around them. So, I don't think we can eliminate software engineers, but I kind of like that as a provocation.
I'll let the software engineers in the room think of some questions to grill him.
But I
now
think,
that he's
we should all,
threatened
as
your
you
profession.
are, you are all working to do yourselves out of a job if you're trying to improve Gemini's coding capabilities and everything else, right? And we know how powerful a technology it is.
Yeah, I'm sure managers and executives are really important. They'll never be automated.
Managers they're key.
Yeah, of course.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
particularly vice presidents.
We'll all be managers.
You can never.
Yes.
It's just going to be vice presidents managing large, large numbers of Gemini, swarms of Gemini.
Swarms of AIs. Yes.
No, I mean, but I think that notion that you could give people this access, and remember, it's a speed up in our information access of something like 300 million, right? So you're going from what you had before as a clinician or a teacher. I kind of think, well, imagine the world where teachers, when their kids, they don't have to worry about their kids getting rid of their mobile phones in the classroom because the teacher, at a moment's notice, can integrate what they're trying to do on their mobile phones to teach a lesson. The equivalent of what a teacher might do with Minecraft nowadays, where a really good teacher might teach something in physics through Minecraft or something, take days for them to set up, or they'd have to download something. No, on the spur of the moment, they imagine something that they can sort of have working on the kids' tablets or whatever else, and they can integrate their understanding with the thing that the kids are most interested in. At the moment, that is so separated, right? It comes down to the children through what a bunch of companies, mainly in California, think the children should be doing, and the teacher is unable to sort of influence that. And that's caused this sort of separation between the information topography, as I think of it, and the professionals, which is very, very dangerous.
Yeah. I'm sure my daughter would love to have her lessons all in Minecraft. So something to work on. I want to come to the title of the book, actually. We've gone through, we've chatted for almost 40 minutes, and we haven't really talked about the title. So the title doesn't say AI, the core of the title. It's the atomic human.
Yeah.
So what is it? Can you spell it out? Can you peel the layers of the onion for the audience?
Yeah, so it's a bit of background on, I started writing about 10 years ago, and I wrote something that was kind of trying to warn about what became Cambridge Analytica, not specifically, but those phenomena. So by the time I was too late to warn about those things. And so over time, I've thought a few different things about the way the book was going. But one thing I kind of noticed is that the things we're hearing around technological existential threat have a striking similarity to Greek myth. And I noticed this about 6 or 7 years ago on the back of Nick Bostrom's book coming out. And I kind of wondered about why that is. And I decided it's potentially because when you're thinking about Greek gods and all-powerful entities, you come up with very similar things as when you think of all-powerful AIs and whatever. You make the same category errors around your gods. And I did a lot on AI and religion. I'm not religious myself, but I have a lot of respect for religions. And I particularly like the way religions cause us to introspect. So I shifted my thinking to the book should be about using AI as a way to introspect. So move from what I see as techno-narcissism to techno-introspection and reflection on us as a society and culture. So that's kind of the message at the core of the book. Now, the title, The Atomic Human, was how to do that. The notion is like Democritus's atom. In Democritus's atom, you cut into the physical world. If you cut something in two, you take one half, you cut that in two, you keep cutting. then these were philosophers, so they didn't actually do any cutting, but they imagined what would happen, and they decided there would be a point you can no longer cut. And the idea of the atomic human is if every time that we invent the computer to do something that we in the past would have thought of as uniquely human, it's cutting into us cognitively. Is there a point where you can't cut? And the answer I give in the first chapter, and I sometimes ask that to the audiences, see what they say. I asked it in my department, no one could come up with anything, but most people have ideas. My answer is the thing the machine can't have is our limitations and our vulnerabilities, in effect our weaknesses, because it's born without them. And in particular, even if you say, oh, we could emulate them today, we could tell the machine, it wouldn't know. We've also been on a journey with those limitations and vulnerabilities together as humans for like 100 to 300,000 years, depending on how you count, as Homo erectus for 2 million, as primates for something like 9 million, as animals for whatever, 800 million. And we're the result of that process, which I just find mind-blowing. And sure, the computer can come along and join in, but it wasn't there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I found that particular perspective really fascinating. Really, we instead of defining ourselves through our capabilities, like, ooh, we're humans, so we can play chess. That's part of being human. Well, actually, we've got news for you. Computers can play chess pretty well. Oh, no, but, we're creative. We can create art and music. Well, we've got news for you. Well, you can write. Well, no, sorry, that won't do either. But defining it in terms of our limitations, the constraints under which we evolved is a really fascinating way of thinking about it.
We have produced these things because that's what gives them their subjectivity.
Yeah.
Particularly the way our culture allows us to overcome those limitations.
Yeah. And one of the limitations you really start out with is, and you alluded to this before, is our limitation in how we communicate. So the bandwidth of us communicating here is laughable compared to computers' ability to communicate with another computer.
Yeah. And that just means that once you've got that, you've got that factor of 300 million underpinning everything, it kind of means, well, everything you're doing now in terms of how you construct that intelligence is likely to be quite different, certainly at the outset. And of course, we see that with large language models. The way they've captured these fundamentally very human concepts that they managed to capture, and I talk about them in the book as human analog machines. They're sort of reconstructing things that we culturally built up over many, many years by having to play this game of guess the next word. It turns out, in order to guess the next word, you need a really good understanding of human culture. So they've come across it in a different way, a very different way, that has exploited their massive bandwidth, which is interesting and fine. But stop talking about it as if it's us. It's potentially complementary to us. It brings an enormous amount. But be very, very careful about, when you're thinking about it, preserving the beautiful things about us and the culture around us that have emerged across these hundreds of thousands or millions of years. That's special. It's not like there's some kind of overall objective to process the most information in the universe. No, there's a beauty, there's a complexity to what we are.
Yeah, so I want to, before I ask my next question, I want to invite audience members to come up to the microphone, or think of your questions, come up to the microphone and ask Neil some live questions. So this point, and you make this point about how we're locked in, in terms of our communication bandwidth, we're locked in, and that's actually terrifying at some level when we compare it to what computers can do, but also fascinating and really makes us introspect about our humanity. And I also think that as we get more and more capable AI systems doing more and more things that, we've done and many things that we can't do, but, benefit society, we're going to have to introspect even further and ask ourselves, well, what do we want as humans from having these incredible tools? What makes human flourishing? What do we value? I mean, do you have thoughts on that?
I have thoughts on, and it came up in a LinkedIn podcast, that I kind of think the first thought is that I know I don't know. And like anyone who thinks they know is extremely dangerous. And I know this has to be a wider conversation amongst many people of different opinions, and not just at the things that sort of we worry about, and like Zoubin put so much effort into increasing diversity, bringing people through at this level, right? But in terms of empowering people in wider society who aren't in this room, who won't be in this room, to steer the technology and convening the right type of conversation. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it feels to me like there's a sort of tension that is a really difficult tension between the sort of central development of that and rapid deployment of it on society, like a hit and hope approach, versus an approach which allows wider society to engage and contribute. The latter is always going to give you a more robust solution. But of course, people have this desire for speed and to see the benefits. I think the problem is you deploy badly and you're actually causing more problems than you're fixing. There's this sort of sense when you look at something as complex as society, you can only see the problems. You can tell me this doesn't work. You can tell me that doesn't work. Yeah. You don't see what's working, though. Look around us. Look at this city. I was in New York. It makes you feel so small. You're looking at these buildings. How's that even possible? No individual knows.
Yep.
And it's mostly working. And to the extent that it isn't working, the right people to fix it are those who are at the coalface, the nurses, the doctors, the teachers, what Karl Popper calls piecemeal social engineers. And empowering them is how you fix that. Not by stepping back from it and imagining that you know better and you can deploy some solution that's going to fix everything. It might fix one or two things. It's quite likely to break a bunch of stuff.
Yeah. And we, I feel that it's, the more I think about AI, the more I read about human happiness and flourishing and things like that to sort of place AI in the future of humanity. Great. Well, we could talk for ages, but I think that's all the time we have. So I just wanted to thank Neil for this great conversation and for his fantastic book and for all of his insights.
Thank you, Zoubin. Thank you. Thanks for the invite.